It's my pleasure.
Is it on still?
Our presenters are Averbook, Master's, Center for Jewish Studies, Katy, Dickenson, Berkeley School of Theology, William Klein, Master's, Historical and Political Studies, and our faculty provider and panel is Dr. Deidre, Assistant Professor of Modern Studies. Please welcome Presider. Oh, no. Speaking, that's just for recording, so just project. I saw my
I don't know.
I'll get. I mean, obviously, yeah. Well, what if folks want to move towards the front row? I'm talking about that.
Let's just turn this over again. Okay, I don't know what you just said.
So yeah, my name is Averbook, and I'm a queer Jewish and a student of a cultural and visual anthropology background in the Center for Jewish Studies. I've begun a project on Deidre, an ancient Jewish practice related to enslavement and sexuality that has been steeped in patriarchy over the centuries. I'm asking if we can reclaim Deidre, reorient to it, and practice it as queer, feminist, and totally embodied people. My answer is yes, and this project is just the initial stages of research into how. To do that, I'll begin with a short background on what Deidre is, and share my positions on the potential to reclaim this practice. I'll also briefly share previous scholarship that strives to reframe and reclaim Deidre, and last I'll offer my plans for next steps and methods. So what is Deidre? The source text for Deidre comes from Leviticus 15, 18, and 20. These verses detail instructions related to women's discharge, menstruation, and behavior, and Jewish men are explicitly prohibited from sexual relations with menstruating women. It specified that the menstruating woman is tameh, meaning that she's ritually impure and unsuited for finished holiness, and that he transmits to the state that ritual impurity. Any objects that people may touch during this time. Nida is the time of tameh, impurity due to menstruation, when a man is forbidden to have sex with a woman. This section of Torah also discusses lepers, male ejaculation, and nearness to and touching corpses, all of which also carry the status of tameh and pure. The status prohibits people from entering the sacred precinct of the temple without purifying and becoming the temple or pure. The text also provides instructions for ritual purification. In the case of a woman becoming tameh, she must wait a set amount of time, the length of which has shifted through centuries of rabbinic discourse. Then she was immersed in a mikvah water ritual in order to purify, become tahor, and return to being sexually available to men. I use the language as it was encoded in Torah to male authorship and eyes. Note that the categories of tameh and tahor apply to both men and women based on the bodily fluids and flows. Note also that this practice is intended for cisgendered and heterosexual couples. The Nida is about impurity related to bodily emission and flow that affected sexual availability to men during the temple times. The categorization of tameh and tahor that included Nida for ritual life during the temple. When the second temple was destroyed in 70 CE, the purity code as a whole lost its relevance, with one exception. The Tanae of the menstruating woman was retained, practiced, and proliferated, and it endures to today. The prohibitions around male ejaculation and leprosy no longer operated in good practice. The scholar Joan Seidenberg wrote in 1997, physical danger, disgust, and fear are the principal markers of good thought surrounding menstruation and Holocaust, etc. He charts fears of dire peril and early radicalism which kept men away from their wives and women during menstruation, and which encouraged, imposed, or forced fealty to the law and loneliness. This theme of danger and revulsion linked to menstruation continues to this day and usually on the secular life. I'd like to transition from this background and definition of these to my orientation towards it and why I'm pursuing this project. So I'm queer, I'm Jewish, I grew up in the Reform movement and have a non-Orthodox, not philosophy or Jewish legally observant background. As such, I'm not speaking to or necessarily addressing the experiences and the concerns of women and menstruants who are Orthodox. I am addressing non-observant Jewish menstruants who likely have never practiced Niddah or perhaps ever heard of Niddah, and to whom, as Rabbi Marshall Prager wrote, the treasure chest of our tradition is hard to open. For many of us, the hierarchical structures of authority and historically heterogeneous, cisgender normative and male authority do not serve. But help going beyond the normative structures and turn to queer theory. Queer theory was first coined by Teresa de Moretus, when she outlined queer as a rethinking of sexuality outside of the norms and binaries defined by heterosexual power structures. Over time, queer theory has extended to encompass the intersectionality of different socially constructed environments. In 2017, Dr. J. Stewart described queer theory in politics as celebrating transgression in the form of visible difference from norms, which exposes norms to be something socially constructed rather than natural or inevitable. A queer interest in Niddah is an inherently transgressive. Before we attempt to reclaim the practice as sacred and possible for queer life, it's important, as Derek Vincent wrote, to pause and make space for the pain and sorrow that this practice has inflicted on some of our ancestors. Over time, misogyny heavily influenced Niddah and developed it into a practice of policing women and sexuality. While making space for the pain of this history, I posit that we can also reorient to Niddah as a time of Kedusha, of holiness in ways that benefit our physical health and holistic well-being, no matter one's gender or relationships. Trans scholars such as Derek Vincent and Rabbi Hava before us suggest that this is possible for men, non-binary individuals, and all women, including transgender women. Reclaiming Niddah can support the collective reorientation to menstruating bodies as holy and sacred while further supporting the sacred sexuality of both queer and straight relationships. Looking at Niddah through the lens of queer lives and relationships could expand on the understanding of the menstrual cycle. When the menstrual cycle is not narrowly thought of for the purpose of pregnancy, we can see it as a purpose of creation and creativity. There are 6 motivating questions for myself and my community that inform my research to reclaim and defend Niddah, menstruation, and menstruant bodies as holy, as well as my research on the meaning of Niddah in queer lives and the relationship between two menstruants. 1. What happens in a relationship of 2 menstruants practicing Niddah where their cycles are offset if they're following rabbinic laws of refraining for sex for 14 days each? 2. Can we orient to Niddah and menstruation as a time of Kedusha and or can the Tameh to have a framework be interpreted for holiness and sanctity? 3. Could we reorient to Niddah in a way that may be more in tune with one's own cycle and less honoring of our cycles and queer bodies and relationships? For example, refraining from sex in the days leading up to menstruating when some people need to go inward versus the time after menstruating, when many feel the new energy being pushed from external connection. 4. How much of Niddah is about increasing chances of pregnancy, and how can Niddah be reinterpreted in queer life if not oriented to being pregnant? 5. Is there a way to reinterpret Niddah as a time in which the body has access to spiritual backgrounds that aren't appropriate for social life? What if Niddah is not a time of negative impurity, but a time of holiness when one shouldn't be engaged in one's duty? And lastly, does Niddah have any origin in goddess worship and cultures that honor the sacred feminine and the first incredibly woven into Judaism? To my knowledge, these are not questions that have been investigated yet. It is only in the last 50 years or so that women's voices have become part of the conversation about Niddah and its reclamation. It's been even more recent that queer menstruant voices have entered the public conversation. In the 1970s, feminist scholar and theologian Deidre attempted to reclaim Orthodox Niddah practice and theology by drawing connections between Niddah and the life of that cycle. 20 years later, he stated he could no longer endorse that essay, believing that her earlier theology ultimately justified the irredeemable, patriarchal, and unjust laws and observance of menstrual purity in communities where women are always treated as unfair. I, however, find nuance needed in the first theological approach to bring non-observant and non-orthodox contexts where women are treated differently than the community whose respondents to. Menstruation, the shedding of uterine lining, is literally the potential for life that didn't come to be. The time of menstruation is a liminal one and is physiologically a descent into rest and slowness before rebirth energy. The earliest 20th century pre-assessment religion teaches about two types of darkness in the world. The first is the darkness that conceals the divinity, the soul, and inner life. And the second is the darkness that reveals. This is the darkness filled with the God's hidden light in one's thoughts, heart, and bodily senses are tuned to the soul and to the spirit realm, such that your heart, your eyes seek out the things of this world. Just as the pre-assessment religion teaches that the last hours of Shabbat are an especially holy time with the transition from 25 hours of Shabbat consciousness to the darkness that reveals, I believe that the time of menstruation can carry the same spiritual quality as the darkness that reveals, and that this makes menstruation an especially holy time. This interest in the special spiritual qualities of the time of menstruation comes from my personal experiences and those of many nurses in my life, although not all. People have very different relationships to their bodies and to menstruation depending on the experiences of physical pain, gender and dysphoria, and whether the external lines support the rest, space, and care that they need to work through this process. Such menstrual experiences have not been part of the rabbinic traditions of religion of the God. Parting without practice through rabbinism to today's modern orthodoxy, Jonah Steinberg wrote that the history of Midah emphasizes the interest, gaze, and sexual attention of the male over and against the past of female, and that these laws were developed in a context where men created and enforced the law. In just the last month, Dickenson wrote 100 years Laura on Midah. Because of Steinberg's point about the history of Midah, Vincent doesn't see much evidence for Midah as a practice of sacred sexuality in rabbinic texts. Women and menstruators were not part of the conversation. Science, consent, and agency are not only filtered to the male rabbis, but sometimes reported as suppressed. Because of this, Vincent claims that rabbinic texts on Midah aren't inherently sacred and we can affect them. Further, the categorization determines a horror, including women's menstruation, and specifically for ritual life revolving around the temple. We no longer have the temple. We cannot ever understand what was truly meant by some days of work for sacred life during temple time. So perhaps we need not be strictly bound by practices meant for time we don't live in. But today people still menstruate, and we need sacred ways to relate to menstruation, the entire menstrual cycle, and to our body as well. The stigma, disgust, fear, and shame around menstruation still need to be neutralized. Reframing Midah has the potential to become an ancestrally wise and ritualistic practice of menstruating and the sacred sexuality to support love and relationships, queer and beyond. I agree with Vincent that the rabbinic texts on Midah are not inherently sacred, and that we could reject the practice of Midah as the Talmudic rabbis defined it. In so doing, we can draw on ancestral wisdom through a new lens, one that centers women and queer people's dignity and holiness of the entire medical cycle, including the bleeding time, which could in practice bring us closer to ourselves, each other, and to the divine. And so where will I go from here? In addition to continuing to work with biblical texts and feminist and queer scholarship on Midah, I also plan to conduct interviews both with two menstrual couples who practice Midah with a few and with queer individuals who are interested and curious about Midah and may or may not practice it yet. This project isn't just from me or for me, it's from my community and for my community of people who menstruate, of people who are in relationships with two menstruants, of people in relationships with anybody menstruating and not, of people living queer lives, or anyone who wants to explore the treasure chest of Midah relating to menstrual cycles and potentiality for cultivating spiritual experience and awareness and practicing sacred sexuality. Thank you. Thank you, Carrie, for that great paper. Our second paper will be by Katy Dickenson, entitled Women Faith in Jail. And towards your questions, I was going to continue this conversation after. We've been jail chaplain since 2015. Every county is different. If you have experience in what you do. So my thesis is that the lives of Americans in prison are human and they have perhaps more in common than they don't have in common. However, the systemic, social, and economic disadvantages of women in American society are reflected in the women index. Women are usually the primary caretakers. Jail and prison separate them from the children, and they often lose their children as a result of incarceration. They enter the carceral system with more traumatic experiences and they undergo more trauma in jail and prison. The chaplains and officers or deputies working with women in prison can be more complex and intense than what can be done. And prayer and faith may be some of the few comforts available in the stressful carceral setting. And just to cover the jail and prison are different. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but they are different. And so I actually work with that. It's a county, it's the local district and their families. And 80% of them are legally innocent, meaning they are unconvicted in jail for 6 years, 10 years. Because they too poor to pay bail. Welcome to justice. Okay, prison and jail are unjust societies and not just all the time. America holds almost 2 million people prisoners. 93% are identified as male. People of color are disproportionately represented, but it depends on where you're talking about. In my county, a Santa Clara County, it is 52% of people. If you're talking about the American South or the East Coast, there's much more in the way of African Americans. Different parts of the country are different, but people of color are dominant in all of that. Incarceration is associated with many personal and socioeconomic challenges. About half of the prisoners in our county have mental illness. About 2/3 have drug dependence and abuse. Some are using drugs and self-medicated because of the mental illness. And many are in and out of foster care, incarceration, mental illness, addiction. Few are innocent, but most seem over-punished because they are too poor to pay bail or higher capable lawyer. And in my master's thesis on the subject, I quoted Gustavo Gutierrez, who invented theology. The question for Job is not whether or not he is a sinner. He knows well that as a human being, he is going to be a sinner. The question rather is whether he deserves the comments to the sinner. Okay, just to be interesting, I interviewed 3 officers who had 15 years experience each, taking care of men and women in jail. And this is unpublished information. But some of their observations, they were was that there are differences. Some of the differences have to do with trauma. Some of them have to do with gender in our society. For example, men are more manipulative. They may treat incarceration like they were in summer camp. Women may treat it more like spending time with girls. And as many of us have observed, in any group, the maturity develops to the level of the youngest. So there's a lot of immature behavior because everybody's acting like in some groups. The main difference between women and men is the history of trauma. Women have a lot more trauma. One officer said women engage more emotionally and verbally, men more physically, men get more programs because there are more of them. About 2,000 in our county and only 10% of female. We can't put together a program when we're talking about surgery with the people. We just can't do it. I have never taught a class on the women's side. On the chaplain on the women's side, I have 2 classes there because I can't put together a class. I have to 12 people. I can't get 12 people who are
of similar level of security, similar issues, and all interested in the subject to this doesn't happen. We're in a meeting here, the question of what orders more than one, and they're getting more stuff because the mom's going to be pregnant. There's a new report out, the Prison Policy Initiative. Please look at their website. Every year they publish an amazing report, mass incarceration, the whole pie. There was just updated last month. And this last month, they also published women's mass incarceration. 80% of women in jail are mothers. Most of them are pregnant caretakers. Women experience 53% joblessness before arrest, and greater rates of homelessness, disability, health challenges, and substance abuse. There's a lot of differences. And just bear in mind that 150,000 mothers will be incarcerated. It is a lot harder for the jail chaplains and to work with the inmates. You get a lot of women who want to support the women inmates, and they get a lot more, say, arts and crafts programs than the guys get. The guys get training, like how to repair air conditioners or on the driver, they're going to get arts and crafts programs. A lot of that depends on who you want to teach. They're all ruled by the rule book, and the rule book says that inmates have rights, and the rights include the right to scripture, the right to religious head coverings and objects, prayer rugs, rosaries. They have the right to individual pastoral care. One of the things that's happened since 2019 is that they got tablets in each other's scriptures. So at least 6 times this week, I've been in to talk to somebody who says, I want to be Muslim, I want to be Jewish, or I want to be whatever it's that they just read the scripture of, and I sit down and I'm like, great, let me talk. You know, and I start on theology and how you're going to have to do prayers 5 times a day or fasting. Like, oh, no, I don't want to. We also hold these diet. So if you want a halal diet, a kosher diet, or vegetarian diet, you got to talk to the chaplains first because that's religious, not that. And so we have a lot of conversations about why do you want a kosher diet when you're not Jewish? Well, it looks like higher the peanut butter. Don't like the bologna. That's not a reason to have a kosher diet. Okay. But they have a lot of time, so they're leaving up. So we're dealing with a lot of religious issues, a lot of theological issues, a lot of people deciding they don't want to do this again, and they want to walk with God, and they're going to find a way. And they may decide that they're going to do it for Odiism, and they may decide that they're going to do it for Islam, and whatever, they're going to do it for God. So, yes, I do have a religious chaplaincy certificate for religious community. I recommend it. Actually get something that's particularly women and it's an example. The one part of this is an example. We have women or women in maximum security. So one of the senior chaplains who was training me to support while she was gone. We went in and talked to her on how she had been shooting for at least all day that day, and probably for several days before, because when she was arrested for religious drugs, the money from her. And there, you can think of a lot of good reasons why stealing an arrest process is somebody that I don't even like this work. Right? But you know, there's reasons that she was deeply distraught that her religious mind was removed. It was the storekeeper in the jail, but she was still talking about it and speaking about it and unable to talk about it. And after an hour, the two of us, mostly me listening, and the other chaplain, you know, amazing with the compassionate and how can we help you? What can we do? How do you help you? How do you help them? What would you like to talk about? I would suggest anyway, you were able to talk to her while you're like, and this was good. Okay? Because she wasn't at the beginning of the conversation and at the end of the conversation. Okay. So thinking about what does it mean to be a jail chaplain, you're choosing to incarcerate yourself. Choosing to incarcerate yourself, not like a prisoner who doesn't have a choice, and not like their family who don't have a choice, because of course you incarcerate the father and mother, or mother, you incarcerate the children. The whole family goes to jail. And the chaplain chooses to incarcerate yourself. You give up all your rights. You don't have. I actually have a cell phone because I'm a big staff member. So 200 volunteers were brought up. You give away your rights. If the officer says jump, you say how so. If you want to be here, you follow the rules and avoid the law. You do what you can because you want access. You get more access than anyone. You get access more than the families. You get access because you can help people who can talk to them and walk with them. And that's what you're doing, is walking with them. And you are choosing incarceration to be able to be the people at the darkest time of their lives. So they are maybe thinking about, how do I not do this? And if you can walk with them in such a way that maybe they don't do it again, and maybe they don't do it in the same way that they did in the last 12 months, they were incarcerated, you can be proud of yourself. And we hold right here, Hebrews 13:3. Remember those in prison as if you were there yourself. Remember also those who were mistreated as if you felt the pain in your own body. These are pictures from 2015. In the first class, the picture was public, basically went out, big county award. This is our bishop, Bishop Williams, who is the vice president of the House of Bishop of the National Bishop Unit. Now, the union of the college of bishops, including Joel, who was an opponent for 15 years. And was now the station up here is going to get PTS and is coming back. And he's going back into jail. Hallelujah. And that was last week. So when you sign up as a jail chaplain, it's a life sentence. Because it's practice.
Our final presentation will be by Klein. It's entitled Traumatic Motherhood, the Holocaust and its Effects on Jewish Mothers.
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to speak at this conference. Just to begin, I would be remiss if I did not point out what most of you would probably assume. I am not, in fact, a woman. So because of that, I will never understand what it is to be a woman who struggles that entails, like my fellow presenters do, or any of the other women in this room do. That being said, I have collected some research and on how the Holocaust, one of, if not one of the most horrific events of the 20th century did affect women, and especially mothers, in very particular ways. And I also propose one possible avenue of making meaning or making life better or more meaningful for these survivors. The Holocaust was especially egregious for women due to the intersectional nature of the public face. Women suffered in the Holocaust not only as Jewish people, but as women also. And the trauma that these women faced among survivors, it did affect how they interacted with the world ever after, and especially with their children. The thesis I propose in my paper is that women who had some form of creative outlet, or some kind of creative way of communicating with the world and with their children in particular, fared better than those who did not. First, before I get into that, I'd like to just provide some context, first into European Judaism, and then also the neurobiology of the trauma the human face. It's important to recognize that, as I'm sure you can understand, the European patriarchy did extend to the Jews living in Europe. Women were not expected to aspire to anything more than motherhood or anything outside the home amongst Jewish people in Europe for and leading up to the Holocaust. Consequently, when women were faced with these challenges, oftentimes, according to survivor accounts, they used the vocabulary of the family to build solidarity with one another. Victims describe how they would see the other women in the camp as sisters or mothers or daughters as a way to build relationships in order to not be alone and to survive, which some did. But the ones who did faced very severe neurobiological effects in the form of PTSD a lot of them. When anyone faces a trauma, it triggers a part of the brain called the autonomic nervous system. This is the part of the brain that controls our body's fight or flight response when faced with danger. When someone experiences PTSD or long-term stress effects from a trauma, that part of the brain, the autonomic nervous system, has trouble turning off. So you are constantly in a state of hyperarousal. You are constantly in a state of being in danger, regardless of whether or not the danger exists after you have escaped it. So the three responses that are often associated with this response are fights, flights, or also interestingly, freeze. All three of these responses have been reported amongst survivor women of the Holocaust. In terms of the fight response, a story comes to mind of a woman who woke her son up in the middle of the night with Presider. When he asked what was wrong, she became enraged with saying, "You don't even know how sick." She then forced him to sing, like the women who she was in the camp with used to sing. She missed the note she was striking, trying to express any kind of anger and the frustration or the fight response that had been so present in our life during that time. Also, you see evidence of the flight response. As horrific as it may seem, some women did choose to leave their children behind with strangers or in the care of local leaders and escape themselves in an attempt to survive. This might seem unthinkable to many, but it's very hard to imagine what one might do when faced with such consequences. But in my research, what I noticed as the most common response was silence. I believe this is an extension of the freeze response. Women were not able to articulate or even acknowledge the depth of the trauma they faced, and so it remained silent. However, also note the women who did find some way to express it creatively did seem to fare better in terms of their mental health. Some turned to humor. I read an account of one survivor named Deidre, who would always joke with her children about her time in the death marches across Germany when she was forced to trek hundreds of kilometers across vast distances, often in terrible weather. But she said, I learned to walk. Hitler taught me how to turn that anguish and despair into resilience. Others turn to writing. There's an entire genre of survivor memoirs that have risen up since the events of the Holocaust. Interestingly, too, to note, much of the time, and in many cases, these survivor memoirs are written by women with the explicit help of their children. Oftentimes, these survivors very purposely include their children in the writing of their stories. I believe this is an attempt to communicate what before had been unsaid and impossible to explain unless it was put down in the form of writing. But for others, the form of writing is not available. So, as this portrait discusses, others turn to art, to painting. This etching was done by a survivor named Regina Filibro in 1949. Picks a scene she noticed where woman was separated from the child. So we see that women are able to cope, able to communicate both with their children and the world if they have creative outlets. I believe that such creative outlets provide a way for women not only to improve their mental health, but also to provide artifacts that can serve as guiding forces and also forces that improve solidarity. When women recognize that they are not alone, when they have pieces like this that allow them to see that others have suffered the way they, I believe that serves a vital function.
Emily sort of continuing papers, we now have students or I thought after the conversation, finding and I was wondering if the research and the Jewish are also looking at I am based on the information today and some other but I haven't.
I just want to say thank you so much, Catherine, to the last semester. You had your Zoom call regarding being Catherine in the jail, and thank you so much for that. Really, I went on a visit to San Bruno jail, and it was horrifying. It was uplifting. It was bad. It was galvanizing. And I want to thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and your experience with the rest of us, and letting us see what is really going on inside the prison system.
Thank you for calling that.
Thank you all so much for your presentations. I have a question for Will and a question for Carrie. But Will, I'm curious if you did any research on the differences in how mothers dealt with this trauma in the context that they wound up in, like in the European context versus the Israeli context versus the American context, right? And imagine there are very different challenges and very different outlets. And very different cultures of remembrance about develop. So I'm curious about that. And Carrie, I'm curious if you've done any research or thought onto the institution of the mikveh itself. Like, have you thought about people who would like to hear people who would like to embrace this practice in a way that is not patriarchal when the local mikveh is an Orthodox mikveh or like a Chabad mikveh or something like that? As well as the attempts to create more expansive mikvahs. Like I think that the most famous one is in Boston, and forget the name of it. Yeah.
There are people living in Pakistan that and I have here
terms of your other question, I didn't look specifically to compare how different cultures value or experience the trauma of the post-trauma of Muslim mothers. But I can give you, I know that at least there was some commonalities between the two of the different cultures. For example, I read an account of an Israeli man, his name was Jordan Atai, who his mother was a survivor. And he said in the introduction to his mother's memoir, he said 364 days a year, we acted as if there was no ghost in our midst. It's only one day a year on Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel, that his mother allowed herself to experience that trauma. So, as you might imagine, that day became somewhat significant in his family. They all knew not to help burden their mother on that day. And then conversely, in America, what I think you might see some of this come out in some of the stereotypes about Jewish mothers. In America, we have this stereotypical image of the overbearing Jewish mother. What I think that might reflect is, on the one hand, it's a caricature. It's not accurate, but it might reflect some of the effects of that these mothers had after it survived so much. There could be some kind of relationship, but that's not as part of it.
So, thanks so much for doing this. This is really important work. And thinking along two categories. One is thinking about the work of the defined residence, which does focus on the arts, in particular in literacy, and for ways of survival. And this was more about that too. The other thing that is really important, middle and upper school history curriculum for placement history, which doesn't really more widely. So for example, focuses also on media things where similar firms that come on the and but I think if they really look at it, I don't think they from the perspective of me. But we like to interested in what they learn. So I'm thinking about that. Now, one of the things that I'm proposing to the workshop is that one thing because both it's more the substance and not to the before I even start. That way of knowledge and and also maybe both the core separate. And so some of that and all the great thing about knowledge. I went through research that we did after trying to deal with that. And then I'm thinking about the relevance to the separation of property and and the time both the moms, mothers, and the babies and children are experiencing them. without connecting with the oil. So I just see lots and lots of ramifications to what we're doing. Yeah, try to move your art from the trauma of separation, and also the trauma of not knowing. As was the case, I think a lot of survivors for quite some time they didn't know if their children had survived or not, or if any of their family had survived or not. And if they did survive, they had no way of knowing where they were. Which I think also kind of compounded on the lesson. But at my core, I'm an optimist. So I'd like to believe that throughout this trauma there is a way to move forward. And maybe art or creativity or comedy do that.
My favorite, my favorite thing is a lot of times when you complain of the having in all cases we try to get one to start my word I say enough. But to hold the women do, the men is sort of a general, most men is a general statement. The women is very specific. It's the difference between somebody who is in charge of the details and somebody who's in opposition. But it's not only what you think, it's the way that I do it. Recently, we did another child. She plays with her child a lot. And it's very difficult to play with that child when you know you're speaking to the child's mother. And yet she's absolutely sincere in mourning her child. People are confident. You're being, you're not there to judge.
I heard more of a comment about how profound these three presentations were under this rubric of women making meaning, and you're presenting, well, how women have found meaning out of their trauma. And so I just want to encourage all of you to find as many venues as possible to give voice, Carrie, to people who haven't had places to give voice, and of course, Katy, the work you're doing and teaching and training others and finding new ways to help the inmates have voice, and all the research you're doing in looking at ways women have manifested a chance to survive from the trauma. And so the thing that I wanted to ask just all three of you, what role do the families play in helping in the women in jail or the women or women or people who have even non-binary people have been subjected to these regulations? What roles do family or significant others in their lives play in helping them to either helping them to survive it, or what roles do they play that exacerbate?
The second one is very different than what we think about in data. In many cases, it's that family that not be into a certain place. Family that, even in the gathering, it's actually together. The actual, you can't really do what you do, it's kind of a place. And yet, when we come in on Wednesday nights to teach my grandmother to teach the class, you see the whole line of living. And sometimes it's none of our guys that are in the class or in front of the class, he's doing it. And because it's just the physical arrangements, we don't need to them, just on the right side of the class wall, before I walk in. And some of them are doing everything that, but the families often have to make a choice. The one that really ripped my heart out was I was in my class for 2 years, and when they began to find because his brother came in and said, you've been asking me to find $10,000 to pay for that. And I gotta tell you, I can either send that $10,000 to raise your family, because that's what I got, or find your life with you. The families are making tough. And some of the families are just despicable, I'm not trouble dealing with a family that forces it into right? But many of the families are absolutely innocent and are glad and you just have to listen and hear that family to try and find some positive way forward. For the person